I remember thinking that it was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, the kind you don't remember years later. The house was quiet except for laughter echoing down the hallway, the kind of sound that usually meant everything was fine. We were playing a simple game, nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, just a moment meant to feel normal. But something shifted, subtle enough that I almost ignored it. Almost. It wasn't what happened, but what I felt. A tightness in my chest. A sudden awareness that something in the room didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off at first, telling myself I was tired, overthinking, being paranoid for no reason. I had worked hard to build this family, to step into a role that wasn't easy, to be patient, careful, and loving. I didn't want to be the kind of person who saw problems where none existed. Being a stepmother meant constantly questioning myself. Was I too distant? Too involved? Too cautious? I had learned to second-guess every instinct because I didn't want to cross lines or create discomfort. That day, I told myself the strange feeling was just another one of those moments. My mind playing tricks on me because I cared too much. But once the feeling arrived, it refused to leave. Later that evening, when the house settled and the noise faded, I replayed the moment in my head. Not obsessively, at least not at first. Just enough to check myself. Everything had been appropriate. Everything had been normal. And yet, the unease lingered like a quiet alarm humming in the background. I tried to sleep, but my thoughts kept circling back, not to what happened, but to why my body reacted the way it did. That's when I started noticing other things. My husband came home later than usual that night. He didn't look at me when he talked. His phone stayed face down on the table, his hand resting on it like a habit he didn't even realize he'd formed. When I asked about his day, his answers were short, rehearsed, empty. I told myself it was stress, work, life, anything but what my gut was starting to whisper. I hated that whisper. Trust had been the foundation of our marriage, or so I believed. I had defended him in conversations with friends, convinced myself that we were solid, that we had survived challenges that broke other couples. So when doubt crept in, it felt like betrayal on my part. I felt guilty for even allowing the thought that something could be wrong. But that night, lying awake beside him, I realized something uncomfortable. The strange moment earlier hadn't disturbed me because of what it was. It disturbed me because it made me aware of cracks I had been ignoring. It forced me to look at my home, my marriage, and my sense of safety from a different angle. I didn't have answers yet. Just questions I wasn't ready to ask. And a feeling I could no longer silence, no matter how hard I tried. After that day, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not out of jealousy or suspicion at first, but out of instinct. Something inside me had shifted, and once that happens, it's impossible to go back to being unaware. The house felt the same, but the energy didn't. Conversations stopped flowing. Silence began to stretch longer than it should have. My husband changed in small, irritating ways. He guarded his phone like it contained something fragile. Notifications lit up the screen, and he would turn it away before I could see them. When I asked simple questions, he answered without details, as if every word cost him effort. He used to tell me everything, complaints, jokes, pointless stories. Now I felt like a stranger sharing space with him. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I reminded myself that adults go through phases, that stress can make people withdraw. Still, his absence wasn't just physical. He stopped touching me casually, stopped asking how my day went. When I tried to reconnect, he seemed distracted, already somewhere else. It was like he was present in body but missing in every way that mattered. At the same time, I became more protective of the emotional balance in the house. I paid closer attention to routines, to moods, to small changes in behavior. I wanted stability. I wanted peace. I didn't want unresolved tension bleeding into spaces where it didn't belong. The responsibility I felt weighed heavily on me, and I carried it quietly, without complaint. The more I observed, the more patterns appeared. Late nights that didn't make sense. Sudden errands. Work trips mentioned casually, then forgotten when I asked about them later. His explanations never matched perfectly. Just close enough to sound believable if you weren't listening carefully. I was listening now. One night, I reached for his phone to check the time because mine was dead. He stiffened instantly, snatching it from my hand with a laugh that came a second too late. He said he was tired, said he overreacted, said I was imagining things. I nodded, but something inside me hardened. That reaction wasn't fear. It was guilt. I started questioning myself again. Was I projecting? Was I letting one uncomfortable feeling spiral into something destructive? I didn't want to become someone who searched for problems just to justify her own anxiety. But doubt doesn't need permission to grow. It just needs space, and I was surrounded by it. Sleep became difficult. My mind ran through scenarios I didn't want to imagine. I felt caught between loyalty and self-respect, between trusting my partner and trusting myself. Every day, the distance between us widened, and no amount of pretending could close it. By the end of that week, I understood one thing clearly. The moment that first unsettled me wasn't the cause of my fear. It was the signal. Something had already been wrong long before I noticed it. And whatever the truth was, I was getting closer to it whether I wanted to or not. It came to me in pieces, sharp and unforgiving, as if it no longer wanted to stay hidden. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the bedside table. A name I didn't recognize appeared on the screen, followed by a message that was far too familiar to be harmless. My hands didn't shake. I felt strangely calm, like my body had already accepted what my mind was still catching up to. I didn't read everything at once. I didn't need to. A few lines were enough to expose what weeks of distance had been trying to conceal. Plans, excuses, words he hadn't used with me in months. The intimacy wasn't just physical. It was emotional, deliberate, and ongoing. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice he had been making repeatedly while looking me in the eye every day. When he walked out wrapped in a towel, he saw my face and knew instantly. There was no denial, no confusion, just a pause heavy with defeat. I asked him one question, only one, because anything more felt unnecessary. He answered without meeting my eyes, admitting what I already knew. The affair had been going on for longer than I could process in that moment. The shock didn't come from the betrayal alone. It came from how easily he had lied, how smoothly he had compartmentalized his life. I thought about the late nights, the guarded phone, the emotional absence. Every puzzle piece snapped into place, and the picture it formed made me feel sick. I had doubted myself, blamed stress, defended him, all while he was actively betraying our marriage. I didn't cry right away. I felt hollow, like something essential had been pulled out of me without warning. Anger followed quickly, hot and overwhelming, but it had nowhere to go. He tried to explain, tried to justify his actions with excuses that sounded rehearsed. Loneliness, pressure, feeling misunderstood. None of it mattered. He had choices, and he chose to betray the family we had built. In that moment, my thoughts drifted back to the day everything started to feel wrong. Not because of what happened, but because of what I sensed. My intuition hadn't been accusing anyone, had been alerting me. The instability in our marriage had been leaking into our home, affecting the atmosphere long before I consciously acknowledged it. I had felt it before I understood it. I realized then that the truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, waiting for you to stop denying it. Standing there, facing his confession, I understood that the marriage I thought I had was already gone. What remained was the reality of his choices and the consequences that would follow, whether he was ready for them or not. The days that followed felt heavy, like I was moving through air that resisted every step. Nothing exploded outward. There were no dramatic exits or screaming matches. Just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had broken and couldn't be put back the way it was. Trust wasn't damaged, it was gone. And without it, everything else felt pointless. I stopped trying to fix what I didn't destroy. That was the first real decision I made after the truth came out. I refused to carry responsibility for choices that weren't mine. His apologies came in waves, sometimes emotional, sometimes defensive, but always too late. I listened without engaging, already detached in ways I didn't know I was capable of. What mattered most to me was restoring stability, not pretending. I set boundaries, clear, firm, non-negotiable. I removed myself from conversations that went in circles and focused instead on creating emotional safety in my own space. I learned quickly that staying silent to keep peace only deepens damage. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. There were moments of doubt. Late nights when loneliness crept in and tried to convince me that staying would be easier than starting over. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered how small I had felt while questioning my own instincts. I refused to return to that version of myself, the one who ignored warning signs just to avoid conflict. I also confronted an uncomfortable truth about intuition. I had felt something was wrong long before I had proof. I dismissed it because trusting myself felt risky. Now I understood that ignoring inner alarms doesn't make you kind or patient. It makes you vulnerable to being erased. Listening to myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. The future didn't unfold neatly. Healing never does. But clarity brought strength, and strength brought direction. I began rebuilding my sense of self without centering it around someone else's betrayal. I chose honesty over comfort, truth over illusion. That choice cost me a marriage, but it saved my dignity. Looking back, I don't define my story by what he did. I define it by what I refused to tolerate once I knew the truth. Betrayal may have cracked my life open, but it also forced me to stand up for myself in ways I never had before. And that, more than anything else, changed everything.